Hi, my name is Joel Behrens. I was the visual effects supervisor for Digital Domain on the Electric State.
And hi, I'm Liz Bernard. I'm the Senior Animation Supervisor at Digital Domain on the Electric State.
The mall itself had its own set of unique challenges, both outside and inside the mall. Outside the mall, we had to deal with creating this beautiful, vast desert environment as they sort of walk through the exclusion zone to try and find this mall. And when they do, they found this sort of land of misfit toys, sort of oasis in the desert of all these robots that want to sort of peacefully live their own lives and not be bothered by humans or any sort of outside interference. So as we get guided to the mall by the wonderful Perplexo, we get to go inside and you start to really sort of see, we start small. You get a couple characters here and there, get some new interesting design characters, and then probably the hardest shot of that sequence was sort of the transition into the big atrium food court area of the mall, which just was meant to be this sort of amazing, vast, hundreds of robots sort of area where they all sort of gathered and socialized. So we had to every type of robot under the sun, much like the scavs, but on a bit of a grander scale. We had, on this movie we had built over 60 different unique robots just ourselves, and we had received also another, 40 to 50 plus unique robots from other vendors such as ILM and Storm. So we basically were tasked with populating this whole environment with just a kaleidoscope of different styles of robots, different sizes, different types, from all walks of life, to try and give this world this sort of, electric feeling of activity and sort of, this is a community in the middle of the desert that that decided to take over an abandoned mall, and it was pretty. The mall was an amazing set as well that the production designer had made. We basically took over an abandoned mall in Atlanta, and they dressed probably 75% of the interior of that mall to have the look of the film that you see there. And it was a pretty incredible location with a lot of fun moments, from the stuff that we did with just the introductions to Mr. Peanut walking them around to a really, sort of touching scene with Michelle and Cosmo sort of watching the Kid Cosmo cartoon as other robots sort of gather around and watch with them in the middle of the night, where Peanut sort of understands that these humans are worth helping. So you get some pretty big story beats in there and things that move the plot forward. So it was a pretty incredible sequence and probably one of my favorites in the movie.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the part of the film where you get these like really strong relationships between bots and humans that really solidify in that moment. And like Joel was saying about Mr. Peanut, seeing that between Cosmo and Michelle, but I think it really solidifies for Cosmo and Michelle in the mall when that in that moment when they're watching that Cosmo cartoon. They have this like deep connection in that moment, and that kind of empathy and love really starts to seep into the relationships between all the other characters as well. I have to talk about Perplexo because Perplexo, for me, when I was told, oh, yes, Hank Azaria is going to be doing the voice for this character, I lost my mind. I was so excited. So I grew up watching The Simpsons and, The Birdcage and all sorts of stuff that Hank Azaria has been in over the years. And it's always been my dream to be able to animate something to his voice. So it was a real pleasure to get to work with that vocal performance that he gave us. We got some fantastic reference of him in his studio, gesticulating wildly as this character that gave us some really fun like inspiration for how to animate Perplexo and his, clunky robot style. And he's just such a ridiculous, like bombastic character. So that was a real fun one and a great one, I think, to start off this like real heart and soul part of the middle of the movie before the heroes go off on their final adventure, which, you know, ends up with kind of mixed results. Um, then, you know, with all these different characters that we both designed and then also ingested from other companies, they were also, again, so different, kind of like I was saying with the scavs, you know, sorts of different body plans and anatomy. And that all influences how we animate them, of course. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but there are strange things that you end up deciding based on the way that the body is put together. Like, for example, Taco, our Taco bot that plays the piano, he's only in a handful of shots for us, but we wanted to make sure we did him right because it's such a funny, just such a funny visual to see a Taco playing, you know, a piano in the middle of the mall as these characters walk by with their hands handcuffed. Um, there's so many great moments like that in the mall where it's just like a beautiful image that is absolutely insane. So with Taco, because he's shaped like a hard shell taco, he doesn't have a butt. Really, like he would have to balance on like a little teeny tiny point. So there's no way to get him to sit at the piano like a normal piano player would. So we had him standing at the piano instead. And because he was standing, the animator was like, well, he should be like dancing back and forth a little bit as he's playing. And so just that like one little design element, the fact that, you know, he's shaped that way meant that we animated him completely differently than we would have if he had been more of like a human character and able to sit properly. Um, and then yeah, like we having so many of these characters to work with, we obviously had our work cut out for us in terms of like figuring out how they all move and generating animation for that big reveal shot and all of the shots afterwards where you see these characters in the crowd. This was kind of non-traditional crowd work because all of the characters in there were bespoke. They were all different, so we couldn't really reuse stuff very much. We could in the far backgrounds, but like in most of the shots, I would say probably 90 to 95% of the characters that you see on screen were hand animated by animators. And in most cases, they were keyframes. We didn't have mocap that we could use for most of these things. And so because it was such a huge chunk of work, we got started early. I had a team, a pretty big team on this show. And so what I did was I assigned each animator 2 or 3 of these background characters, gave them like 500 frames to work with, which is quite long. But we wanted to make sure we had enough material for all of these shots for them to not feel repetitive. And then I asked the animators kind of to just put their own personality to the animation for that particular character. And like you have to base it on the body plan for the character. Like if it's a character that rolls, you know, that means certain things for how you're going to animate them, but like add your own personality into it. And because we did it that way and we like managed to get all of these different performances from like a diverse group of people and, you know, different ages and genders and everything, what we ended up with was like this cool mix of all sorts of different ideas and jokes. And like some characters were funny and some characters were serious. And they were all felt kind of real because people had put so much time and effort into that movement. And I think that's one of the really special things about that sequence is you can really feel the humanity behind all those bots. I think because so many people put so much like blood, sweat, and tears into that work, not just the animation, but the character design and the modeling and looked at all of that. It's like just everything was considered and worked on by a whole bunch of people. And I think you can feel it.
It worked really well. That was a big sequence, like amongst the many sequences that took place in the mall. You know, that was a pretty good collaboration between the multiple vendors that worked on the film. Like we did the intro, you know, ILM worked on the diner section of it, and then it jumped back to us where we were working on, you know, them at nighttime, and then we jumped back to ILM who did like the sporting goods stores with Popfly. So, and I felt like everything maintained a pretty good consistency because we, you know, we stayed in touch with each other and worked really hard to come up with a language for these hero characters and sort of the way that they moved and acted that I think was one of the more successful partnerships that I've come across where we just kind of had to because we were all doing the same characters together in different scenes. So it was really nice and it worked out really well. The amusement park was a pretty challenging thing to deal with, and it wasn't really we didn't have to do much as far as the environment build because the production designer Dennis Gassner did a brilliant job of designing this small full-size amusement park in a suburban Atlanta water park parking lot that we spent a couple weeks doing night shoots at in very cold weather. Um, so we didn't have to do a whole lot of sweetening to that environment, which was nice because it all looked pretty amazing. We did, the typical stuff. We added some atmosphere. We needed to extend it in the deep background to make it look like it was a little larger than we had the footprint for in that parking lot. But it was a unique setting that allowed us to bring a lot of tension to this battle because we knew that we were in from the story of the movie, we knew that we were in this sort of area where the scavenger bots lived, and it was a dangerous sort of renegade area where these cannibalistic robots sort of roamed the earth and basically hunted down other robots for parts for themselves. So you've got all these sort of Frankenstein robots that set up basically a trap for our heroes as they try to find the Dr. Amherst. And so we had some really fun unique animations that we could do with these scav bots that came to life between the panda bot and then there was a couple other bots that were pretty fun for us to do, and we did a little bit of crowd work as well where we came up with a system to sort of mix and match parts on a robot to create unique body shapes and forms out of sort of a library of parts, which helped us out a lot for filling out the room as it were. um, and then at a certain moment, our heroes fall into a trapdoor, and we're down in this sort of Frankenstein's lab, which is basically a small set that was built on stage in Atlanta where we shot. But when we got around to doing the Marshall and Mr. Peanut fight, we ended up having to re-choreograph that later in post, and we weren't able to do that before the reshoots were finished. So we ended up building that room down there in full CG just so that we could do the moves that we needed to do to make the Marshall Mister fight a little bit more dynamic and interesting with sort of sweeping camera moves and that sort of thing. Plus, we had to add all the electricity to the Tesla coils that were in there, which were practical builds with LED lights in them. So it gave us the flexibility to cast a bit more interactive light on areas we needed to and replace those Tesla coils as needed to give some really cool effects to those. But yeah, it was a good build for the interior of that room. I was pretty happy with that, and it was a fun sequence to play with.
Oh yeah, and plus we like had to slam Mr. Peanut up against some of those Tesla coils at various points throughout the fight. And yeah, and I think the Marshall gets slammed up against one too. So
It
that would have
does.
been pretty hard to manage if we hadn't just built the whole thing in CG. So that whole like chunk of the sequence is basically full CG
Mhm.
chunk of the sequence. Which is it's fun because it gives you the maximum amount of control over what it looks like and what you can do. There's no animation, you can't do that. We could do kind of almost anything that we needed to tell the story at that point. And then for the beginning part of that sequence with all the scavs, I mean, there were so many different kinds of scavs. It was a little bit overwhelming. All the different body plans that we needed to deal with, because some of them had 3 legs, some of them had 2 legs, some of them had no legs. We had one that was like this big giant like terrifying looking dentist drill thing that was articulated, that I mean I guess it kind of looked like one of those
Mhm.
robots that you would see in a car manufacturing plant, um,
Mhm.
that was supposed to like go right at the camera at one point. We had a character with like a clown tent attached to the back of him for no apparent reason that I'm aware of. And then a blade saw, like you would find on a circular saw, like for a hand. I mean, just like I don't know who came up with this stuff, but it was terrifying.
Two-headed chihuahuas.
Yeah, two-headed chihuahuas. The two-headed chihuahua, for some reason, only had 3 legs, so that was hugely challenging to figure out how to animate him in a way that made sense. I don't know if that's the right word even.
Mm,
Or, so yeah, the scabs themselves were just like completely crazy concoctions that, some of them even had like multiple heads as well. It was
mm,
crazy. So figuring out how we were going to animate all of those different styles of body, because we're way past being able to use mocap in most of these cases. We got to just do this from scratch, in a way that they could be advancing on the humans and the bots, like the heroes that are trying to get to Dr. Amherst, but without them overtaking them. Like they couldn't be too fast. Was pretty tricky, to come up with reasons for them to go a little bit slower. So we gave many of them like a limp, or we dragged a leg behind them in a funny way. And sometimes we had little backstories for why different characters couldn't go any faster than they did, to try and explain it at least for ourselves. And I think some of that stuff comes through in the final edit as well. It was pretty wild. And then of course, when the Marky Mark song comes on and they all like freak out and they're in pain and they start running away, that whole part of the sequence was tricky as well, because they needed to get out of there quickly, but not faster than they had been following the heroes in the first place. So yeah, we had a good time animating that sequence. I think, you know, I would have loved to have had even more shots with those characters because they were so
for sure.
crazy to look at. But they added a lot of like spiciness to that part of the film that was really fun.